part of being in the NFT space is learning the meta, learning what works, what doesn't, where value goes, where value doesn't go. And a big part of that is having to have skin in the game. We talked about some of the difficulties of squaring that with journalism, where a lot of times like you supposedly can cover more objectively or better if you don't have skin in the game. In the NFT space, it still seems like you learn the best when you do.
Welcome, everybody, into another Coinage chat coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios here at Coinage. I'm the host of Coinage, Zach Guzman. Very excited to have Andrew. I don't know what title's going to work best for you, honestly, but I could throw out 3 different titles. But Andrew Wang, the man, the myth, the legend of NFTs, Web3, journalism. We're going to get into a lot on this space. But Andrew, thank you for being here, man.
Man, it's really good to be here. I think there are probably like 3 people in the world who can drag me out to Brooklyn. So...
And it took a bit. We went to a different Sahadi's today, but eventually you landed here in Sunset Park, where our studio is based, where we have these discussions with leaders in Web3, in the world of NFTs, in the world of crypto. We've had a few people out here in the studio, including the co-founder of Solana, Anatoly Yakovenko's been out here, a few other people, but honestly, super stoked to drag you to Brooklyn to have this convo.
Yeah, so you said I went to the wrong Sahadi's. It's actually not the most embarrassing time I went to the wrong place. A few months ago, I was supposed to go to a meetup out in LA at this place called Cabo Cantina, because it's a place for like happy hour margaritas and Mexican food. And I showed up to the wrong Cabo Cantina because I came in and there was nobody there. They're playing like the Ravens game, but there's not a single person in the bar.
Yeah.
So I looked around. I was like, maybe I'm early. And then everybody else was asking me, like, where are you? Like you're so late again. And I realized I was at the wrong Cabo Cantina. So I had to do the most embarrassing thing, which was call an Uber from Cabo Cantina to Cabo Cantina. So when I got in the Uber, the driver just looked at me like, all right, I know what's going on. Yeah. And I went to the next Cabo Cantina, showed up, had nachos, immediately got terrible food poisoning. Tough. And that's how I met one of my best friends. But yeah, first Cabo Cantina, now Sahadi's.
Well, listen, I don't know if we're going to go to Sahadi's after this whole spaces, but we can, and hopefully it doesn't end in food poisoning. It hasn't for us yet here at the Sahadi's in Sunset Park. Shout out them. We're not sponsored by Sahadi's, but we've mentioned them like 5 times before you've even gotten into this space. No, but Andrew, thank you for being here. Excited to have kind of a discussion that I think will turn into me interviewing you, you interviewing me. Us talking about the space writ large, but also talking about, I guess, specific projects and kind of your learnings as someone who's kind of launched, not only things for charity and what you've done for Ukraine, but also just innovative art projects like what you've done through Splat. And we can get into all those. But a lot of our audience, it's probably a mix of your followers, our followers. So, Coinage is all about kind of explaining it to a mainstream audience, high level, big picture. So I feel like you're a perfect guest to have on to kind of talk about all these things because the space changes so quickly. But I guess we can just start on how you landed in this space. You're a young guy, but what's interesting is our head writer, Zach Abrams, takes a lot of credit for saying that you should drop out of Columbia J School and dive into Web3. I don't know if that's true, but maybe we start there. Why you're even in this space.
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm happy like you gave me a warm intro because I feel like you... In terms of who else you've interviewed, I mean, the first episode you guys did was interviewing Do Kwon after the Terra collapse. So I was like a bit worried. I was like,
only hard-hitting question.
I was like, hopefully I didn't do something like that. Yeah, it's been about 2 years in the NFT and Web3 space, and you're right. So Zach, the head writer here, he was my boss in college.
Nice.
And now it's like the tables have turned, Zach. So he just gave me the middle finger.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
We're very hospitable here.
But yeah, it was sort of this this feeling that something really interesting was going on here. Journalism at the time for me felt like it was something where you would just kind of grovel and work really hard for months and things wouldn't materialize. I was a freelance op-ed writer. And so, you can kind of imagine how that is, trying to get a story out, taking a lot of time just for an editor to kind of ghost you.
Yep.
Or even for an editor to take your work and be paid $300 for weeks and weeks of work.
Yep.
And I was sort of at a point where it was like, okay, if I keep going with this, I have a sense of what success looks like, and maybe it's not going to be for a few years, or I can sort of throw it all out the window, or maybe just try something new and see if I can bring my past in journalism into something new. I feel like that's in a sense what you guys are doing. And as we're going to talk about, I'm sure like there are a lot of challenges that come with that.
Yeah.
But it was like a leap of faith moment. I never really got to take those huge risks in college. I feel like with COVID towards the end of my senior year, kind of screwed some things up. So when I saw a chance, it was sort of just like, we have a saying, fuck around and find out.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like my fuck around and find out moment. I definitely found out.
I think you found out a few things, honestly, and we can talk about the journalism findings. You're talking about being a freelance writer, and the Washington Post piece I've heard you talk about too, in terms of earning $300 from a piece that really meant a lot to you, and writing something that means a lot. I feel like that was, in my journalism career, I feel like it's even the farther you go, right? And I was an anchor at one point, and having worked at Yahoo Finance and CNBC, like I would say it feels the same way sometimes. Like you can put a lot of work into something as a journalist, and sometimes it just doesn't feel like the value comes across. And so, we tried to do this whole new model, and that's kind of what Coinage is working on in terms of creating content that truly does unlock the value. And I think that's what drew me into the space too. And I think that's something that you and I probably both agree on, is the idea that like using this technology, NFTs, the power of community to unlock true value in a way that, doesn't just go one way. It's weird. Like Web2 for media, at least for me, is all about a show growing an audience, but there's no value that's given back to that audience really. And so what we're trying to do here is to where it's both ways, where the show grows with the audience and that power is given back to them. And, if they can weigh in on what we cover and make our stories better, hopefully it lands, bigger guests, like you said, Do Kwon in season 1, but for season 2, who knows? People in our community can help us land, I think, bigger interviews for season 2 too. So we'll get into all the journalism aspects. I know that's not what a lot of people show up for here, but they do show up for NFT learnings and projects that you've kind of been leading, and also things you've been seeing in terms of the way that the space has now evolved. Since you got in, what do you think has been, it hasn't been very long in terms of, the space as a whole, but what do you think has been like the biggest change since you got into the Web3 space and where we're at now?
I feel like every few months or even every few weeks, the meta changes in NFTs. And then we start to talk about it as if it were something that's sort of just like been around forever, or something that's code or law.
Yeah.
Right now we're in like the open edition meta. Before then, gosh, it's even hard to remember. Like we had like free mint meta, we had the allow list meta. And it's very interesting, like seeing the culture shift very, very quickly, see different faces and names come in and out of the space who have attention, who are launching their project. In that sense, like sometimes I ask myself, like, if I've sort of fallen off because I've been in the space too long, and I'm kind of a dinosaur. I haven't dropped an open edition.
How old are you again?
24.
Okay, yeah.
But I think it's more just about the space moves really fast. And one day you think it's going to be this kind of meta, and then the next day, it gets patched.
Yeah.
And it's like, this doesn't work anymore. And then all of a sudden everybody sort of rallies around a new idea that can be totally different than a couple weeks prior. So it definitely keeps you on your toes. And I guess people always try to predict the meta or where the space is going, but it's very, very hard in a lot of ways.
I mean, I guess, we were just talking before we got on about PFPs and kind of like the way that has been, I guess, the big thing that took off. All of the huge blue chips, if you want to call them that, essentially are kind of, PFPs. Mm-hmm. That would maybe lead a lot of people to expect that NFTs forever will be that. It sounds like you're maybe more in that camp in terms of PFPs being like a very important thing in terms of unlocking community and stuff. But like you're saying, I feel like that might change. At least I feel that way. But you were saying all roads lead back to PFP, so maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, when I got into the space, like really fully, summer of 2021, PFPs were sort of like the first use case for what community actually looked like, because you could see other people and everybody had a Twitter account, and maybe you have a Bored Ape, I had a cool cat, whatever. And I think over time that's definitely been tempered a little bit. And sometimes I go the other way, where I'm like, okay, I thought this was community, and that turned me into a bag holder, and I'm the one holding everything to zero where everybody else is flipping things.
Yeah.
There's the other hand where I look at certain PFPs or communities, I'm like, wow, this is totally stupid. And then that sort of blinds me to a lot of the work that they put in.
Yeah.
Whether it's on the branding side, the IP side, growing their community, making people feel seen. And all of a sudden I'm like, this is actually pretty interesting. I think Pudgy Penguins is a good example. I don't own any Pudgy Penguins right now, but people associate me with an upside down Pudgy Penguin because I had an upside down cool cat.
Yep.
So people took the upside down aspect and they're like, okay, how can we win Andrew over somewhere else? And I'd had a really great conversation with Luca Netz, who basically, I think in April of last year, took over Pudgy Penguins and sort of turned it around. At the beginning, I feel like I was Gigabrain because I saw that Pudgy Penguins started as a pump and dump from crypto Twitter, where people would come in and just buy it and sort of meme with it. Early on in PFPs, we always said that if you start with community, then you get to value. Here is one case where I was like, Pudgy Penguins totally looks like a pump and dump, and people are rallying around it and trying to make memes and joke about community so that the floor price holds up. And I feel like for a time I was right, but then once, new ownership came in and it swapped hands, more people started doing things with it. I was like, wow, like I was totally wrong, I think. But I'd sort of overlooked that because I hadn't been following it. But I think it's a good question. I think PFP sort of phase in and out of, is this real community? Is this real value? Seems like it's going to have a place in NFTs for a very long time.
Yeah.
But that's where I started. So full credit to PFPs for that.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, that's the reason why almost in all of these interviews with NFT people or like leaders in the space, it's tricky because like, yes, what they're known for, like you said, you could be known for an upside down cool cat or an upside down Pudgy Penguin, but that is underselling who you are as a leader in the space by like probably a factor of 100, because, owning things, I guess, is a signal for everyone out there in terms of like, okay, being early to a project or understanding where the value is in some of these projects. But it's not just that. I mean, like I said, the creation of all this stuff, including Splat, I want to kind of focus in on that. You as a creator and kind of a leader and figuring out how to launch some of this stuff, because I love Splat. In terms of, for those who don't know, I guess maybe you could describe it in your own words, kind of like what Splat was, in a way to interact with basically any NFT art on the blockchain. You essentially allowed people to splat them with tomato juice, virtual tomato juice, that is, at a time when that was going on in the real world.
Yeah, so I think a question I always try to ask myself, maybe it's not for everybody, but for me, it's fun. It's like, if NFTs are this new way of creating things, creating value, creating experiences, creating community, like what are aspects of NFTs that are sort of, maybe endemic is the right word, like endemic to NFTs or particular to NFTs? In other words, what does it mean to make an NFT that can only be an NFT and not anything else? Like it can't be a print. It can't be something in the physical world. How does working digitally, how do we see that as a constraint that sort of leads us to create interesting things? And with Splat, a few months ago, I'd seen at these museums, like at the National Museum in London, there were protesters coming in and throwing tomato soup on paintings like Van Gogh's Sunflowers as a kind of social commentary on the planet, saying, how can we just say we care about art when the world is going up in flames, so to speak? And I remember a friend seeing that and sending it to me and being like, hey, at least our JPEGs are safe. At least you can't do this to NFTs. And whenever somebody says you can't do this, it just makes you think, well, if you could do it, what would it look like? And so I sat down with some friends. Their names are Backseats, Psyduck, Danny Cole, who's an artist I really, really like as well, a longtime friend. And we said, guys, like, let's take 72 hours, stay up all night and just build some sort of commentary on this. So we came up with this project called Splat, where we made 1,000 JPEGs of tomato soup cans, branded it, whatever. And we turned it into this game where you could basically throw tomato soup on JPEGs. And it was sort of like, how is that possible? We had our dev write a contract where it could interact with other contracts and the tokens inside that contract to splat them with tomato soup. So basically how it would be was, if you had this tomato soup can, you could find, let's say, a Bored Ape, right? Bored Apes live on a particular smart contract. Each Bored Ape has a token ID associated with it. So we built this like super bare bones interface. We didn't even build an interface. We just went straight up on Etherscan, where you could write contract on Etherscan.
Really?
And I was like, we could sell this story of like, this is cool. This is like a heist where you have to be a hacker, but really we just didn't want to build a UI. So it's like, saving on cost and time, but also having a bit of fun.
Yeah.
You could go in, find the contract you wanted to splat. It would pull the token URI from that contract, let's say Bored Ape 1763, and it would make a copy of that Bored Ape that pointed back to the original contract, and then splat that Bored Ape, and then it would lock so that you couldn't splat that same Bored Ape again.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of fun. It was sort of like, we have this limitation of like, we can't actually throw tomato soup on JPEGs, but if we could, what would it look like? And it was sort of fun because, maybe some people saw throwing tomato soup on an actual painting as a sign of disrespect.
Yep.
It sort of depends where you fall on like the protest to like, respect, disrespect kind of spectrum. But for us, we saw it become a form of like deifying others' works.
Yep.
So it's like, if I'm splatting your JPEGs,
It's important enough.
like I had to think of it, or it mattered enough where I would pay, I think $40 or $50, which is how much we sold it for, to kind of do that. And I remember I splatted people's every days,
Yep.
the first 5,000 days. That was kind of fun because I tweeted about it and I was like, got his ass. Just trying to bait people into responding. And then
Yeah.
it got a lot more attention. Somebody else splatted one of Dmitry Cherniak's ringers. And it was actually a way that they sort of got to know each other.
I think that's why it was genius, though, is because like it's so like all these projects, right? Like we can ask about a few of them over your course that kind of triggered your brain in terms of like, okay, I see it now. For a lot of people in the space, there's usually a project or something that they see and they go, oh, wow, that's cool. I want to be in Web3. For me, like Constitution DAO was like a moment in time where things clicked in terms of the power of community, people coming together with a mission, even if it's as simple as let's buy a replica of the Constitution and see what we can do with it. Like there's power there in community. And I thought Splat was cool just because it was like, okay, there's power here in interacting with things that are established. It's really hard to get anyone who's built in Web3, really hard to get a project off the ground. And you can use your own connections, you can do whatever. But when you start to leverage some of this stuff, which I thought was cool with Splat, and that was another project that I'd put up there as one of the most interesting in the ways that it, achieved that virality. Like you said, it kind of tapped into existing communities, existing artworks, existing creators, and basically, grew from there. So, I mean, for you, what was kind of the reaction when you did do that? When you're saying, I got your ass, and you're splatting people's artwork and you're seeing it grow like that, was that the plan all along? Or was it just like, well, no, we just want to see what would happen if you could do this with NFTs?
I think a big part of NFT projects kind of are the ability to which you can create a meme, because memes spread fast. Memes are something that people can sort of understand, but it's also a bit of like a secret language, a secret handshake. That's a bit of what NFTs are to me in general, right? It's like everybody else just sees pictures. Maybe people joke that Mutant Ape Yacht Clubs look ugly. Everybody likes to dunk on mutant apes, basically. I like to dunk on mutant apes.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, there's a value to it. There's a community to it. They can be kind of self-deprecating, which is interesting. And so all of that sort of constitutes a meme. And I think after doing Splat, I didn't fully realize the meme potential until after it was done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been sobering in some ways. Like I think the past few weeks we saw Jack Butcher come out with checks. And I saw that and was like, holy moly. Like, this is awesome because we made a meme and he made a meme too off of all the commentary about Twitter verification.
Yep.
But he, I think, in my humble opinion, like, I think he executed checks better than I executed Splat. And so it's always like a learning lesson. You watch different artists and creators, create memes, execute projects, pay attention to the details.
Yeah.
I'm sort of going back and saying like, okay, like what would it have looked like if I had been more theatric with Splat? You saw another project, Pingers, which was like Pepe Ringers, that this guy Devin Figures did. I thought it was super, super cool because he fully bought into that meme of like, there's this museum and we have the Pepe Ringers and, all these like little storylines going on. The same way with checks, there's a bit of that storyline of like, what's the value of a check if everybody has one? Everybody can get one for $8, and then this is how we're going to sort of change the art over time.
Yeah.
Things like that are cool. And I'm always sort of thinking about the things that I create and what everybody else is creating and trying to trying to learn from that.
Hearing you talk is interesting just because I feel like, so when we started Coinage, right, my background came from being a financial journalist and watching crypto, like blockchains, like mostly just the tokens on blockchains and the pricing of that and the community effects of that. What's weird is that since we've launched, we've also seen like the disconnect between people who are drawn into crypto in this space from NFTs and like the art side versus just straight up blockchains and like the tech side, or maybe even just investing. And now you've got this weird hodgepodge of both of those worlds colliding, I think, in 2023, which is exciting because as a journalist in the space, it's both of those things now, and arguably both equally important in the success and where we go from here. I mean, I don't know if you look at it that way. Honestly, having this discussion, I realized even before you came in that I would be maybe in uncharted waters, outmatched in terms of your understanding of art, the culture aspects of NFTs, and where I come from just kind of like covering it as a financial journalist. But I feel like the culture and NFT piece has become so important. And, you know, the similarities and parallels drawn from the old art world maybe are fair in terms of the old art world's kind of sketch. Like the dealers and like the pricing and the auctions and everything's a little bit sketchy. And you know, there are critics of kind of NFTs now in terms of, all right, who actually owns these things when they're dropped, who has access. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of, are there projects or things that you've seen that like maybe stood out to you as like, this isn't as transparent, or, you know, what percentage of players, actors in the space might be more of that than, I guess, wholesome, real projects? Like what the actual breakdown is there.
Yeah, you know, what you're talking about reminds me of a Oscar Wilde quote. It goes something like, when bankers get together for dinner, they talk about art. When artists get together for dinner, they talk about money. And that's always been a bit of an interesting dichotomy because, you know, like you said, the art world is probably pretty sketch.
Yeah.
But I think the NFT space is also pretty sketch as well at times. But with that quote, I think it's interesting because it's sort of like, not to say like artists can be bankers. I think when I think of bankers, I just mean more like when you're financially invested. Whereas we've had this trope of the poor starving artist for forever. It's sort of like, if you're a collector, you can also be a creator. And if you're a creator, you can also be a collector. And I think that dynamic is something that's just super new that we're trying to figure out. I mean, you know, you talk about me as if like I have my finger, I have my pulse on the art world of NFTs.
Yeah.
But like I never considered myself an artist until I got into NFTs.
Yeah.
I was just collecting things. And I think at one point I ran out of money from collecting things.
It's easy to do, man.
Well, like my only path forward is to try to create some things because I can't just collect forever unless I were to maybe raise for an NFT fund, which I probably should have done. I had a good friend, Spencer, do a really good job. His whole motto was like, please fumble your JPEGs to us.
Yeah.
And he's great because he's both an artist, having worked for Nike and Red Bull in photography, as well as like a total degen collector.
Yeah.
And I think people like that are very interesting. In terms of things that are sketch, I'm at this point where you understand what can be done on the blockchain. We always talk about how it's transparent. I don't know, burner wallets, sweep your own floors, things like that. Like we know all of these things are possible. And I'm sort of at a place where I think everybody should think, if you imagine something's possible to do on the blockchain, it probably is happening.
Yep. But it's out there, and I guess
it's out there. I had a friend tell me, he was like, when you drop your project, you should make a ton of burner wallets and sweep your own floor, because if the floor on the allow list mint is higher than the public mint, people will see the delta between that and see the profit, and then you'll instantly mint out.
Yeah.
And to me, that's like a crazy idea because you can get away with it. And like, I'm going to put it out there. Like, I'm not going to do it, but it's also like a scout's honor type of thing.
That's the thing though. I feel like how much of that is like kind of part of your rise, right? Because you're rep by UTA, I think. I mean, like it's hard, I think sometimes hard to find people that you're like, okay, like a lot of brands reach out to you from my understanding and like ask you for your opinion and your take on like how to actually have their projects go well. Like it's hard to find people in the space, I guess, you know, as a trustless space, at least that's what it's supposed to be. As you said, Scout's honor and like all this stuff's out there, to find people that you feel like are good actors. At least for me, sometimes it's like, okay, who's real and who can we like talk to? I feel like that's maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a piece of your rise in terms of like, okay, like being doxxed is a thing. Apparently that's a selling point. I still laugh at that a little bit because it's like, how is that the bar? Like with our drop, with Magic Eden coming up, like we have a little dox thing on our thing because like, you know, I've said who I am, which is a weird bar, but like how much of that is true to it in terms of like, okay, yeah, Andrew's a good guy. We can talk to him because like, I guess you have a history of all this stuff and like relative to the other people in the space, like, is that something that should matter? Doesn't matter? Is that part of the story here?
Gosh, I think at the end of the day, the space doesn't have a very long memory.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to look at somebody and be like, you've done X, Y, and Z. That's why I trust you or don't trust you on this.
Yeah.
I feel like the news cycle does go by really fast and people sort of forget things you've done in the past unless there are NFTs. So they'll look at whether the floor price was sort of good or bad. The doxing part is interesting too, because it's almost like if you're already doxed, like cool. If you're undoxed and you're trying to sell a big project, you should maybe be doxed.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're like really cool if you're undoxed for various reasons. Somebody else threatens to dox you and then you dox yourself. Like that's the perfect trajectory. Part of me is like, how cool would it be if I had like come in with like, you know, an Anon name, but before I was, you know, about to sell a project or do an NFT, people were like, I'm going to dox, you know, whatever, like Wordna, which is Wordna.eth, which is Andrew backwards. Like, I'm like, surprise, like I'm actually Andrew. And if I did it on my terms, it would be cool. It's a hard question to kind of answer because I think we don't necessarily have standards for everything in the space yet. I mean, that's why brands, when they reach out, a lot of times they're like, I don't know what's going on. There was a really big entertainment platform that reached out to me, asking me if I would promote a tweet of theirs in return for tickets for me and my friends to their exclusive show. And I was sort of like, that just sounds like the worst thing I could do, because it would be totally obvious if I went and just promoted you guys. I don't really particularly need tickets to your show. And so I sort of like had that
listen, I don't know how to tell you this, but I don't really need those tickets / don't want them.
It's hard because we're talking about my rise. I think I was just somebody really excited to be in NFTs.
Yeah.
And so when I like something, I talked about it. I like Cool Cats, so I talked about it. And I figured enough people knew, or it was common enough information that I was a bag holder in Cool Cats that nobody would say, oh my gosh, well, he has all these Cool Cats, because you can see it on my wallet. I think it's pretty obvious that I have a bunch of Cool Cats. And I think people liked that we could all talk about projects freely when we really like them, especially in 2021. Now, I think the landscape has totally changed now, especially with the bear market and, you know, people who might call me an influencer.
Yeah.
That's a responsibility I don't know if I was immediately ready to take on.
Do you like that title?
I hate it, but I think it's also something that like,
I hate it.
You know, like if other people call me that, then I should be aware that people use that term. Influencer is such a loaded term in the space. It has such negative connotations, but it's a good question of like, how do we talk about things we like openly and transparently, while at the same time, you know, getting to kind of be ourselves. I think that's maybe why I pivoted to art. Yeah. Because I used to host spaces for people all the time, you know, do it for free, do it for the culture. It was fun. It was simple. And then everything professionalizes. Projects start to raise from VCs. They have tons of ETH volume. Big brands are coming in. And then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, you know, if X big brand asks me to host a Twitter space for them, I don't really want to take money. But at the same time, if they're selling a project for millions of dollars, what position am I in? And I think at one point I kind of just threw my hands up and I was like, you know, I'd prefer to just make my own art, because then it's a lot easier to justify.
It feels less dirty too, in a way, I guess.
Well, because you get to avoid all these potential liabilities
and biases and conflicts of interest. I mean, like as a journalist in the space, I struggle with the same thing. That's kind of how we landed on the coinage model anyways. And we're trying something different with our drop. And people who are listening right now, we are running a Gleam contest to give away free NFTs as we approach our February 9th drop through Magic Eden. But basically, you know, we're trying something new where it's, you know, 1 mint per wallet situation, where it's trying to really get them out to people who believe in the project, which is decentralizing a show that can talk about all these things. But I struggle with that too. I think journalists do in general. It's like, how do journalists get paid for their work? Because you don't want to be seen as like a shill, right? And like, we can talk later on about the Terra thing, because it's like, I was drawn to the project, and I think a lot of people were, because they believed in the need for a decentralized stablecoin. I covered it a lot. I used it because the only way you can really figure out how any of these projects work is like getting your hands dirty.
Yeah.
And so like, I don't know, people, including some other publications, were like, yo, you're using it, you're talking about it, you're shilling it. And it's like, no, I'm trying to learn. And I'm like revealing to everybody things that I've learned, pitfalls, potential problems, which is kind of how we landed the DoQuan interview, because we like wanted to set up an interview the same week that it blew up. We were supposed to talk to him about like potential problems. And boy, I think it's fair to say we might have been right on that one. So, I mean, like, I don't know. It's always tricky, but I feel like, you know, you and I are similar in terms of, all right, what's the right way to go about this in a space that's truly evolving, and like everyone's trying to figure out like the right way to cover these projects, to like talk about them, arguably promote ones that you feel like are good without seeming shilly.
Well, when you did the DoQuan interview, I remember you guys got a little bit of heat for that.
We did. And that's fair. Honestly, like that's what our project is built for, is because like if people think you're biased, which happens all the time, right? Like ask anybody who normally watches CNN about a story published in Fox News if they're going to believe it. And it's like, if bias and like all that stuff automatically discounts like half the country in this case, then like how are we going to like tell stories that we can all mutually believe? And so, yeah, we got a lot of heat when we did the DoQuan stuff, mostly because, and I would say looking back on it, you know, telling a story when there's so much pent up anger, when people have lost so much money, like we put out a story basically doing a deep dive on it, when I think a lot of people just they wanted blood. And, you know, that wasn't exactly what our piece was built. And Coinage is like kind of a brand built around like understanding stuff, where we try not to sensationalize things because that's good for clicks. In general, coming from like traditional media, like that is what the system is you optimize for clicks, you don't optimize for truth. And I think weirdly, using Web3, using NFTs, like our model sets us up to really deliver news and facts to our audience in an unbiased way. So yeah, I mean, it was tough to get heat, not gonna lie. As a journalist who's kind of dedicated himself, and like the team here has dedicated ourselves to like digging into truth in these projects, it was a little tough to like see the blowback in terms of like, you know, people calling us out for potential bias, when like the whole point of Coinage is to have it be community owned. So everyone can say, this project's good. And then someone else in our community can say, no, it's bad. And here's why. And we duke it out internally and then present the story to an audience. That's basically, it was cool and very shitty at the same time to watch that all play out. Cause it was like, cool, this is why we're needed, because people are attacking us for facts. But also it sucked because people were attacking us for facts. If that makes sense.
You know, one of the ways that I see it is sort of like, without you, would that interview have happened?
Without me personally?
Well, without Coinage setting it up, do you think other people would have heard from DoQuan? And do you think, you know, how do you imagine it would have gone?
I think it's been fascinating to kind of watch the same way that the SBF Media Palooza happened, right? Because it's like, you know, he did GMA, he did a lot of these things, he did the New York Times, like he did a lot. And did any of them, like, I mean, a lot of headlines came out, but did like anyone walk away with a deeper understanding from any of those? And like, that's what we were trying to do with ours. I think for sure, because we were sprinting, we pulled like 3 all-nighters trying to publish the DoQuan interview, because Bloomberg, I think, was also lining up something, and we wanted to get ours out the door before we got scooped. But yeah, I think, you know, if we didn't do it, someone else was going to do it, but I don't know if they would have told it the same way, I guess. And so, you know, that was important to us in telling like the full story start to finish for a mainstream audience. Like if you had never heard of DoQuan, never heard of Terra before, could you come to our piece, watch it, and understand? And I think that that's kind of like what we're trying to do at Coinage, is like, okay, I don't know anything about any of this stuff. And me personally, I'm not an expert in everything. Like I really knew stablecoins because it was intriguing to me. But it's like, if we have a community of NFT holders who are able to flag, yo, this is really worth covering, or I'm an expert in this and this is why it's interesting, like that's cool. Because then we have like a decentralized newsroom of like 9,000 NFT holders who can flag cool things, who can tell us how to tell the story. And that's something that I have not had at traditional media outlets. Like it's kind of impossible.
I mean, if anything, you sort of get that live feedback in commentary.
Yeah.
And, you know, I remember CoffeeZilla, I think he did a great job like weaseling his way into Twitter spaces so he could talk to SBF.
I did see
because
that.
I think SBF wasn't, agreeing to be interviewed by him.
Yeah.
I believe. And so I think that's cool. I think that's really crafty. I think Twitter Spaces is so interesting for doing interviews because in a way I do feel like it's already more authentic because everybody can sort of see what's going on. People are commenting in real time, which never really happens. The other Zach and I were talking about how in Web2 media, the comment sections are basically like so underutilized. Even in the New York Times, there are New York Times picks and then there are sort of like reader picks. But unless you comment in the first few minutes, they sort of just disappear. There's no real dialogue. You can't like reply back and forth.
Yeah.
There's nobody with their own platforms commenting. It sort of goes underneath the New York Times. And so for what it's worth, I think it is kind of cool to experiment with these live spaces and live interviews.
Yeah, I think you're right. Our whole thing is this experiment of breaking down the wall between a show and its audience. And, it's like for that feedback for like in real time, what should we ask Andrew? Which we have community questions and we might open it up for Q&A. But it's like, there are opportunities in terms of getting guests and then you might miss something. And as a journalist, I'm sure you've maybe felt the same way in your career where it's like, damn, hindsight 2020. I wish I go back and do that story maybe a little bit differently. And it's like, if I only knew when we were in that story or like interview planning phase to ask about that one thing. And it even happened with the DoCon stuff too, right? Because we hadn't launched yet. No one had heard about us. So like we didn't have that opportunity. And like, even after we published, there were a few people I think with like Wrapped Luna who were really mad that we didn't ask about that. And it's like, I honestly didn't even think about that. And so like, it's an interesting way to bring your audience into it. And I guess we've shifted into this discussion around journalism. We can talk about it now because you've invoked Zach Abrams, our head writer, again about his talks with you and you being like, dropping out of Columbia J School. Talk to me about that in general and like why that was the right call at the time, if you still think it is, or if you blame Zach for that. Because like Columbia J School is a great journalism school. And like, you're probably set up to be pretty well placed as a journalist, even after that, writing for the Washington Post and everything. Like, do you look back at that decision at all?
When my JPEGs are down, I look back at that decision and I get mad at Zach.
Yes.
And then when they're up, I forget about it.
Price heals all.
But, I think like being in the NFT space is dramatic, or at least it's been super dramatic for my life. I think I credit two people mainly for getting me to drop out of school.
Yep.
Zach being one of them. The other being this guy named Matt, who's starting his own Web3 company, working with brands right now. At the time, he was consulting for Tom Sachs, who's this incredible artist, a god of plywood, in my opinion, one of the best like artists of our time. And I've been a fan of him for like maybe like 8 or 9 years now, which is crazy because especially not seeing myself as an artist or a collector, to have a few artists sort of break through into my life when I was a lot younger, and then to see them in the Web3 space. Again, just to emphasize how important Twitter is, it was Zach convincing me, and it was a Twitter thread that I'd read. It was from Tom Sachs Rocket Factory saying, here's a giveaway, here's a competition, and we all love giveaways. We love free NFTs. We see the ETH price attached to NFTs, and we're like, hey, let me enter this contest. And this contest was saying, what's your dream rocket that Tom Sachs could build for you?
Yeah.
What brands are on it? And people would joke like, oh, I would do like Ferrari, because Ferrari, or like McDonald's, because if this shit doesn't work out, I'm gonna be back at McDonald's. Yeah. And I sort of looked at that, and it was my opportunity to write a thread about my life and my family and some of the challenges that I'd been going through at the time. Because, Tom Sachs, he used to work as a janitor and as a repairman. And my uncle, one of, my close family members who passed away when I was young, he had worked those same blue collar jobs. And so that was a huge way of me seeing somebody in the art world that I thought was all elitist and bastards, and seeing somebody like Tom Sachs come from the same cloth as my family and then become one of the biggest names in the art world. And Tom had this video long before he got into NFTs called Advice to the Young, which to this day is like my favorite Vimeo video, because like how many like good videos are on Vimeo? Sorry. I hope nobody
trashing Vimeo right now.
Man, that was kind of mean.
No,
But
it's all
anyways,
good. We're not sponsored by Vimeo either.
well, now we're definitely not going to get sponsored by Vimeo.
No.
But in this Vimeo video, he's sort of saying, you know, my advice to the young comes from this story where he says, I used to work as a janitor. I worked a literally shitty job for years. And paraphrasing this, you know, he said, I worked a literally shitty job because I was cleaning toilets all day. And one day I was scrubbing this toilet, looking down into the toilet hole, seeing all this shit. And I had this realization. I could either resent this toilet and keep resenting it, or I could make it shine. And the moment I decided to make it shine, that's when I became an artist. And when I saw that, it just completely destroyed my world. Sort of like, you know, no matter what challenges you go through, you can sort of see things in a different light. You can choose to be creative. You can see yourself as an artist despite all the constraints around you. And that made me fall in love with Tom and his work. And then I got into the NFT space because of Matt, this other guy who was working on this project, read my thread referencing that story, calls me up, says, drop out of school right now. You can help me with this project. We hated each other.
Wow.
Didn't work out as friends or
Partners,
employees together. Yeah. Terrible, because I'm like super emotional and like very, you know, Myers-Briggs. I'm like very much an FP. Okay. Whereas he was like super cold and calculated, operator, sees things in black and white, always on time to meetings. I hated him. I was like, this dude's the biggest asshole. He was like a Wharton frat bro, worked at Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
And then dropped out to do crypto. But he helped me become friends with Tom Sachs to the point where I've been able to cry out all my feelings on Tom Sachs's, like, you know, gray sweatsuits. He's invited me out to pizza parties that were secretly rocket launches for me.
Yeah.
Where he would have me launch a rocket with him and I would just bawl on the street afterwards because I felt like, you know, it's the conversation I would have had with my uncle. And Matt, you know, like Zach is one of my best friends and Matt is also one of my best friends. Went from hating this guy in Web3 to a couple weeks ago helping him set up his proposal to his longtime girlfriend.
Yep.
I went to his engagement party. Everyone there was from his frat at Penn. Mm-hmm. I was like one of two like crypto people there. And it's sort of like this cool feeling of like, I see my life coming together by being in this
moment.
Space. Yeah.
A little bit there. I mean, you talk about like the blue collar nature of it. I feel like, I don't know, is that an important piece of all this too, in terms of like artists finally finding their worth in the space and the idea that like, okay, real value can go back to artists using this technology. I mean, that is honestly, I think maybe one of the motifs, one of the themes that has stuck, at least for NFTs. I mean, is that top for you?
Well, it's totally iterative, right? Like for the longest time, a huge value prop that was simple to understand was saying royalties.
Yep.
Hey, you're an artist. If you come to this space and you sell your work for $100, if it ends up being worth $10,000 later, you're getting 6.9% of those royalties. And then a few months ago, we had that discussion about zero royalties where we said royalties aren't actually enforceable necessarily, right? On on contracts.
Yep.
And it started this big discussion where you had things like SudoSwap and Blur come in, where they were much more efficient markets in some ways. But then there are these discussions about, you know, are royalties aligning incentives between creators and collectors, or are they not? And then we had this big battle of like protecting artist royalties. And I think that was interesting because we shifted from what we thought was like de jure, like, okay, on the contract level, you can enforce royalties, to a point where it was more about culture. I think that was a really, really key shift for me to witness. At one point, people said, well, you can't actually enforce these everywhere. But then it moved to, well, if it's not the law, with smart contracts being the law, what about culture? What about people coming together and deciding, hey, we should do this? You know, one-of-ones were never affected in this discussion.
Yep.
You know, I own a one-of-one Drifter Shoots piece. He's a very close friend of mine. That dude has been through a lot and has lived to tell the tale. If I ever flip that piece, there's no way in hell I'm not going to put royalties on it.
Yeah.
Because one, it would be absolutely detrimental to my own reputation.
Yep.
And also just doesn't make sense. But I think watching the shift from, well, we thought it was a contract thing. Wait, it's not a contract thing. But if it's not a smart contract thing? Can it be a social contract thing?
Yeah.
And I think seeing that shift is a sign that the space is maturing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess, that is secondary in terms of the secondary sales that come through all this stuff, and kind of the idea of, all right, value is being transmitted through the blockchain. Some royalties go back to the original creator. I mean, tying that discussion back to journalism and kind of the idea of that, you've talked in previous interviews about kind of like the defeat you felt in terms of your piece that was very emotional and very personal to you, going out, getting paid $300 and not seeing the reaction you had hoped from the work. I mean, I guess, what interests you in terms of the realm of some of this being applied to what would have been your alternative career path in journalism? Projects like ours, maybe other Web3 media projects. We don't only talk about Coinage here at Coinage, but like all of those who are also paving the way for potential models. What about that in terms of your head is exciting, interesting in terms of bringing some of that value back to you? People don't look at journalists as artists, maybe, but there's an argument to be made there.
I think if you asked of the people in the NFT space, who is a journalist that also is like an artist in some ways, I think a lot of people would say Zach XBT, because he does these amazing blockchain investigations, has returned tons of money from scams, called people out, puts all that stuff on chain. And he's sort of this like hero, anon sleuth, whatever. And I think it's interesting because I think investigative journalism became a lot cooler to me once I got into Web3.
Yep.
Getting into investigative work for me was hard in the Web2 world because you need all these resources, you sort of need these leads, you need access. It's very daunting.
You know how to file all kinds of things.
I haven't talked about this publicly, but I was trying to do my own investigative stuff during COVID by going to Clubhouse rooms. And I was meeting with people who said they were victims of Havana syndrome, which if people don't know was, we had US diplomats at the embassy in Cuba, many of whom reported hearing this like loud screeching noise that like brought them to their knees and gave them concussion symptoms, like some real crazy stuff. And I was going down that rabbit hole asking myself, like, am I just being lied to by people?
Yeah.
Is this like a huge case where like, if I do find something, it's an Insta Pulitzer at age 24, but I'm going to be in hiding for the rest of my life? I was like talking to colleagues at papers like The Atlantic, and I was like praying they would be like, oh, this is just dumb, don't talk about it. And their first response would be like, let me get you in touch with The Atlantic's IT to help you secure your computer. I was like, well, shit, like maybe this isn't my path. And I felt like I was always doubting myself. Like, am I just getting hoodwinked and bamboozled this whole way through?
Yeah.
And do I actually have the resources to pull off an investigation? Whereas in Web3, it was kind of fun learning how to read Etherscan. That became like a superpower where all of a sudden we could host spaces and do live investigations. There was one where I did it with a couple friends. Their names are VGF and OK Hotshot, where we did this live crowdsourced investigation where we found the scammer who had stolen like over 300K and gotten him to return the money live on Spaces.
Wow.
I was like, wow, like you can do that. And all you have to do is learn how to read Etherscan.
Yeah.
So that was actually really empowering to me. And if you take it back into the Web2 world, there are ways that you can sort of do these investigations, like Open Secrets. That's a great way where you can look at funding.
Yeah.
Most of SBF's funding to various places, like they're on Open Secrets, and it's kind of fun to parse through all that data.
Yeah, Zach XBT is also another one that I wrote about as well, just in terms of seeing the on-chain sleuthing that's required. And I feel like it's a huge thing for the space. Because, unfortunately, there are a lot of things like that to document, bad things to document. And then, once it's documented, a lot of people think that that's the whole space. So, maybe that's not great. But it's important to police this stuff so it doesn't happen and people don't get away with it. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, I suppose. But yeah, the stuff he does is incredible. And like the value, I think it's interesting to see kind of how people have been donating back to him, kind of how you extract some of that in terms of being able to afford it. I know you too. I think you were also around the OpenSea stuff that happened there with one of their employees. You also were sleuthing around on that too, in terms of like finding some of like stuff that happened in terms of sales on the platform. And like there are things like that are tracked in the open if you just kind of do the work. But I guess sometimes people don't want to do that work unless there's a reward for them.
And, at the same time, not everything can be traced on the blockchain.
Yeah.
I think it's a good narrative to be able to say, hey, everything is transparent on the blockchain. But in a lot of cases, it's people, let's call it like making mistakes, who think they're able to obfuscate where funds are going and not doing a great job of it.
Yeah.
And then it makes you think, like, how deep does the iceberg go? You know, are we only picking out all of the low hanging fruits, right? Stuff that we can see, very obvious, you know, mistakes, things like that. Because it can be hard. Sometimes you, like, if money goes through Coinbase, it just says it goes to like Coinbase 5. So I've tried like looking
In a
things
way,
up
it's
where,
kind of like tornado cash. If you want to look at it that way, you want to hide some stuff.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, it's all interesting, and it's all kind of like new world stuff. For our listeners out there, I want to reset here because we do have Andrew Wang, if you're listening on our side, in the studio here in Brooklyn. We've been talking for almost an hour here, so we're going to open up Q&A questions in a little bit. Before we get into that, if there are people request, and we'll see if we got questions from people who are listening on the spaces. But a reminder too that we're also running the program here at Coinage, where you can follow us on Twitter through the Gleam link that I believe is pinned to our profile. We're giving away NFTs ahead of our public drop on February 9th to grow out what is a community-owned show, to address all these questions and try and get to the truth for some big stories in crypto and tell them for a mainstream audience. But Andrew, I mean, we've been talking for an hour. I feel like we should shift into what has you most excited right now. We've talked about things in the past tense, the future tense, as we wait for questions, maybe listening on the space to kind of phone in and or to come up here on stage with us and ask theirs. But what are you most excited about? I mean, you're a guy who all these brands turn to and say, yo, what should we be doing? Brands sometimes don't do things well. Porsche got a lot of criticism with theirs. I don't know if that was necessarily due criticism. Depends on the way you look at it. But what have you seen, I guess, in terms of brands interested in stepping into Web3, common faux pas, common mistakes, and the advice you give to them in terms of trying to do this authentically and well?
I think one of the things we always say is just, if you spend time in our community, get to know us, get to know people, have some conversations, show yourself as human beings behind whatever brand or logo you represent. That goes a long way. I think I've also been trying to tell brands, like, you know, make sure you communicate that as well.
Yeah.
Like I have some friends who represent brands that are dropping NFTs, and sort of like they've been in the space for over a year, but they haven't been tweeting about it. They haven't been jumping into spaces. And so when they come out, they still don't really get the benefit of the doubt. I also think with brands entering the space, sometimes launching a PFP is not necessarily the best use case for your brand.
Yeah.
I think I always try to think about, you know, what's my wheelhouse and what am I good at doing? You know, some brands just have like really good like product distribution, and they can make like skateboards and like refrigerators and like tables of anything like with their brand. So I'm like, okay, maybe you don't have to like drop a PFP. Maybe find a way to get people access to these cool physical things. On the other hand, I'm sort of like, just experiment and be willing to do that. I think that was really fun because I advised for Cameo for a time, and I was sort of like, can we do more art stuff? And they were super down to do more art stuff. And, you know, my friend over there, Oliver Maroney, and I got to curate this drop where we brought a bunch of artists together and said, hey, you know, if your work was a piece of glass and you shattered that piece of glass on the ground and it broke up into 30 pieces, could each piece still be called a piece of art? The same way when you smash glass, it's not just like this is a shard of glass, like it's also glass.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to do that as a way to allow people to collect one of ones instead of only collecting edition pieces. Because if a one of one shattered is still 30 one of ones, it's kind of cool. And now people can have that access. So, I mean, full disclosure, I'm done advising for them. So I have like zero financial stake at all, like totally zero.
Yeah.
But it was fun to be able to bring artists from the space together. I always like it when brands are like, who are the people in the space doing things? Who are artists and creators really putting themselves out there, maybe not having the value of their work being seen yet, and partnering up with them, helping them out. There's a brand that I hopefully can try to get involved with, my little like decentralized soccer team. And that's sort of like, that could be fun, and it could be a cool community thing.
Yeah, I was surprised at more sports teams. I mean, there was early talk about like kind of, you know, splitting up ownership stakes in like a bunch of sport teams, like when things were running hot. I think even like Ice Cubes, I want to say like that 3-on-3 league also was toying around with like letting fans co-own franchises and stuff. And I was excited because it seemed like that was about to spill over into some real world like true ownership stuff, which would be cool. And then I think, when things cooled off, that interest kind of waned. So it's tough to see kind of some of that going on. But you also, before we got on, you were talking about mutant apes. You don't own any mutant apes. You also don't own any Bored Apes, right?
But people think I do.
People think
Maybe
you do.
perception is more powerful than reality.
Perhaps. I don't know if you want to get into it.
I do have a very high score on Dookie Dash.
We were going to ask you about that. What do you think about all that stuff? Because if you don't own them, but you also play, I mean, I guess they're winning somehow. I mean, how do you look at that project, Yuga entirely, and kind of, I guess, pro-con?
Well, for what it's worth, I do own a CryptoPunk, which is, I guess, in the Yuga ecosystem now.
There you go.
But I think, as we talked about before, a huge part of being in the NFT space is learning the meta, learning what works, what doesn't, where value goes, where value doesn't go. And a big part of that is having to have skin in the game. We talked about some of the difficulties of squaring that with journalism, where a lot of times, like, you supposedly can cover more objectively or better if you don't have skin in the game. In the NFT space, it still seems like you learn the best when you do. I mean, with a sewer pass to play Dookie Dash, you literally have to own the NFT so you can play, or you can have somebody delegate to you. But to me, it was important that I owned it because, one, I wanted to play the game, but two, I wanted to think about how others might think about the game, and as well as my experience with it. I think when you have a space that's so new and nascent, a huge thing is about problem solving. I think a lot of people like to say, hey, is the NFT space moral or not? Is this like a good place to be to build the future? I think it is, because all the moral good stuff, all the moral bad stuff that we have in the space, that in a way is separate from the insane amount of problem solving that we do in the space every day. Like, people have been trying to figure out, how do I get good at Dookie Dash? And I've been staring at the leaderboard because I could hit a good place, like, top 400, top 500. And then I just watched that get obliterated by the next day. Like, a top 500 today is 10,000th tomorrow. And it's interesting where people are learning, how do I use Boost the best way? If there are some gamer friends out there, how do I delegate my pass to them so maybe they can try once or twice with their enhanced reaction times? And then overall thinking, okay, where should I try to place? What's the best way to maximize my potential value? Like, should I buy a bunch of T1? Should I buy one T4? Just go and send it all the way. I think that's like the meta video game aspect behind what Yuga does with so much stuff and what so many projects do. Like, it's about, like, being part of NFTs is like playing this ultimate, like, drawn on open world, never ending video game where we're trying to figure out what works. And that's sort of fun.
Live experiment kind of in real time. I mean, there has been, I guess with Yuga specifically, like, weird pushback recently about, like, the idea that all they do, and I know this is kind of unfair, but all they do is just like, okay, we drop another thing. All we are going to consistently do is just drop new collections, and that's what we're building. And the video game is kind of interesting because it's kind of their first foray into, no, here's a product and here's how it's going to work. I mean, they also get criticism weirdly for, like, bringing in VC money. And kind of how they've been playing that game. I mean, I don't know how you think about all that in terms of, like, okay, if that's a piece of, like, why you haven't necessarily bought in as much beyond the CryptoPunk, or like what it's supposed to be on that culture element where it's like, okay, if you're taking in VC money, is it really Web3? But I don't see why that conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel about VC money?
I think it's a good question. I mean, for us, right? So even watching, like, people in the Web3 space, Web3 media space, it's been like, okay, you can go with a drop to raise money that way and then fund your project, or you can raise money and then do the drop where you don't necessarily need to lean on revenue. So you don't need to do these shenanigans, and you can just straight up kind of put the collection out there and say, all right, whatever happens, happens. And you're not focusing on revenue because you don't need it. And so that's kind of like the way we went in terms of, having a back, like all these projects like Jenkins the Valet, Tally Labs, like they have, like, companies attached to them. And it's been interesting to see VCs invest in those and the NFT collection be separate. And so, they're kind of necessary pieces because if you know how much money you can use on getting your project off the ground, it helps. Whereas you don't need to necessarily rely on the drop to fund it. So I don't know. It's like getting to the same destination, but coming at it from 2 points, I guess. But we, of course, do not have billions of dollars to play with relative to some of these other giant names like Yuga. And so I don't know. I guess it depends on what you're trying to solve and what the product is you're trying to build as well. For us, it's really the product is a decentralized show covering crypto. So I guess it depends. I guess it depends what you're trying to do.
I'm still not sure where I stand on it. I can see the ups and downs of both.
Yeah.
And it's always, I think, part of me, because I've tried to be so tapped into the community, and hopefully people feel that way. I'm always like a little bit like skittish of like, wow, like if I have to raise for my company one day, is it just going to be a bad look if I go for VC money, or does it have to be like all community based? So yeah, I'm learning in real time. I mean, I didn't start making angel investments until about a year ago.
Yeah.
And I had this joke where I was like talking to friends. I was like, okay, I've written a few checks. How do I get my money back? And is it too late to ask?
Yeah. How do I make money off of these?
But yeah, if anything, Web3 is giving people like me a chance to just try new things out. And at the very least, you can say Yuga has taken in billions of dollars of VC funding, or maybe not billions of dollars. I think something like $500 million at a $4 billion valuation. I feel like at the very least, people in the space have more insight into what's going on than with traditional companies. And that's kind of exciting. It feels a bit empowering in some ways as well. And so I guess we'll see how that plays out.
I think it's just interesting when you think about stakeholders and like the idea that, yes, to your point, VCs, if they're giving you money, they expect to be paid back at some point, somehow. The value unlock needs to be there. And it's like, okay, who becomes the person you're really working for, them or for your community? And I guess that's always like something that any founder needs to like kind of think about when they go down that path. Certainly something we've thought about here. And as we only have a few more minutes here on the space with you, I feel like I'd be remiss if we had you in as an advisor and we didn't ask you questions about our own project and things like that. Can't have Andrew Wang come all the way out here to the wrong Sahadis and then we don't ask you about it. So I feel like, for Coinage itself, we've been raffling off, I guess. Christy, I don't know how many we've done. Our social community manager has been doing a few of them. So congrats to anybody who won them on these space. Thank you for letting us host this space with you, by the way, co-hosting. I mean, have you tracked any other projects in Web3 media? Like looked at them? I mean, obviously there's a lot of them. Rug Radio, Mad Realities, Jenkins the Valet. There's a few of them. I don't know if it's an area of interest for you, honestly.
There are a few of them, but probably not enough. I think it's always amazing how things can sort of spontaneously happen.
Yeah.
I mean, all credit to Rug Radio. I'm pretty sure the idea just sort of happened in a Spaces with people saying, hey, this could be a cool decentralized radio show. And they were doing this thing where I think Farouk was sort of just saying like, whoever wants to get in, just like DM me. You could be like director of vibes. I think I was chief jazz kazooist for a time. So some friends know that I'll like mess around on a kazoo, and I'm actually like kind of sick on it.
Yeah.
I can play like really like jazzy stuff on a kazoo.
Bro, you should have set this up.
And I played it in a space one day, and they're like, okay, you're chief of jazz kazoo.
Yeah, that's a position we don't have.
I saw my name on a document that said Andrew Wang, chief of jazz kazoo. And like, I've spoken on some Rug Radio shows. I'm not formally involved with them, but I think it was cool how this idea just came because there was a need that was there.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, not every media show is, fully built out and professionalized, but I think Twitter spaces are always getting worse and better. But I try to focus on how some are getting better, watching lots of creators sort of find their voice in Twitter spaces.
Yeah.
That was cool for me. Part of me still hates human interaction and is like deathly terrified of it.
Yeah.
But being on Twitter spaces, you really, really learn to practice. And I've gotten to a point where half the Twitter spaces I do, it's like in bed with my shirt off and my neck craned against the headboard. But like people think maybe I'm like in some studio doing something.
Yeah. For people listening, we got to be clear. Andrew Wang is naked in our studio right now. So that's basically what's going on. You can't see it live, but his head's still cranked. No, he's here in clothes and we are in a studio. It looks very professional, but no, I appreciate you coming out here for all this. Honestly, I mean, like, again, I think what you're focused on and the projects that you've built are proving out what's possible in Web3. I think it's been really cool to watch. Splat, I didn't actually have time, I'll say, to get involved, but I wish I did when it was happening. Abrams and I, Zach Abrams, our head writer, were talking about it. And I feel like, people look to you for kind of where this space is going. And so for you to lend us not only your space, your platform here to let us kind of chat on with you, but your time to come all the way out here to Brooklyn. I really appreciate it, man. Honestly, it's been a good chat, and I hope it's been a good use of your time.
Like, so where the studio is, it's like in Brooklyn, like by the docks, by the water. And when I got here, I looked around and I was like, this is totally the place where I would be invited for for an interview.
Yeah.
And then I would just get like shot in the back with a silencer, like,
well, even though
and
the
then I would
space
fall into the water.
even though the space is coming to a close, doesn't mean you can't be killed, my friend. We
That's
wouldn't do
true.
it on live
That's true.
air.
There's still time.
We're not going to do it on live air. There is still time. No, but Andrew Wang, appreciate you coming all the way out here to chat with us, man. Thanks again for the time. Thank you for everybody who's listened to the space. A reminder that our drop coming February 9th. If you listen to the space and you want an NFT, DM us your wallet. We'll get you those. But Andrew, thanks again, dude. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And I want people to know, like, I'm not involved with coinage personally. I really respect Zach. I think he's an amazing journalist. I was excited to be interviewed by you.
Well, you got to come back.
You guys are fighting the good fight, and I think it's great, and I hope more people pay attention to that.
Thanks, dude. I appreciate that. You got to come back. Hopefully this isn't the first time we're able to cart you out to Brooklyn.
Hey, maybe next time, or hopefully not next time, I've like... Okay, I was going to say, like, I hope the reason, like, you brought Doquan on is not the reason you bring me on next time. Hopefully, like, it's me making some cool art stuff that I'm working on, and I'll be like, hey,
we'll focus on the building next time. The success stories is what we want to get into.
I'm focused on building, and I'm gonna try to do it as honestly as I can.
There you go. Same here, man. That's what Coinage is here for too. Andrew Wang in the studio. Appreciate it. Thank you everybody for listening. We'll end it there. Hope again to have you back on a Coinage chat pretty soon, my friend. Thanks everybody for listening.